According to Korban and Izutsu, two pioneers in the field of Ibn Arabi studies, theosis or deification, in the sense of mystical union with God. Now, having heard this talk, I have to be open to some severe question about just identifying theosis, deification with mystical union with God. In the vulgar understanding of the terms, let's say. This is deemed to be impossible for Ibn Arabi and by Ibn Arabi. So they claim that since for Ibn Arabi the absolute is absolutely unknowable in its essence, the highest possibility for the soul in the purpose of the absolute is a visionary experience of or a mode of union with a particular modality of divine self-manifestation. Ibn Arabi's lexicon. This ultimate mystical experience is moreover determined by the receptivity or preparedness inherent in the individual's immutable archetype, what Ibn Arabi calls al-ayn al-thabita. And here I prefer Theosis Burkhart's early translation of this key term in the vocabulary of Ibn Arabi as archetype rather than William Chittick's entity or John O'Reilly's identity or Ralph Austin's essence. And I think it is very close, in fact, to Plotinus' conception of the individual archetype. While there are indeed grounds for making this claim by Korban also, we believe that these scholars are wrong in restricting the scope of mystical realization in Ibn Arabi's spiritual universe to the domain defined by the individual's aim thabita. We would argue that the spiritual degree of consciousness evoked rather than defined by the terms theosis, deification in the Platonic and Christian contexts, is realizable, mutatis mutandis, within Ibn Arabi's doctrine of the oneness of being, wahdat al-wujud, or simply in accordance with his understanding of the metaphysical meaning of tawheed, the realization of oneness, the cardinal tenet of Islam. And again, thank you for your clarifications about theosis as a process rather than an end state, because that is exactly what tawheed is. It's the verbal noun of the second form of the Arabic verb, wahada, to declare, affirm, make, realize oneness. It's a process of realization and not the kind of end state unity. What is excluded from Ibn Arabi's perspective is the idea that the human being can in any sense become God. The slave remains always the slave. The Lord remains always the Lord. This is the ontological duality that cannot be transcended by the individual soul, despite the fact that being, wujud, is one. But as we shall argue, what is impossible for the soul is possible for God, in accordance with Jesus in saying in Matthew 19:26, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Let's begin with this graphic image of no whiff of lordship. Ibn Arabi states, the ultimate illusion is for a person to bring together Lord and slave through wujud, through the oneness of being. This is because the being of God is absolutely identical with his own aim, with his own essence, being. And when I say he for God, I'm just following the Arabic gender here, where Allah is always referred to as him, but the essence of Allah is always referred to as she, her. So there's no kind of gender bias implicit or inherent in the Arabic usage of terms for God. So God's own archetype or his own essence is absolutely one with his being, whereas the being of the slave is a property, quote, which the slave is judged to possess. The slave's being, which is a property bestowed upon him by pure being, is distinct from the slave's aim. So Ibn Arabi declares, the slave should stand in a station from which no whiffs of lordship are smelt from him. It's on the basis of such affirmations as this that Corban categorically denies that union with God is something attainable within Ibn Arabi's phenomenology of being. Corban tells us confidently that what a man attains, the summit of his mystic experience, is not and cannot be the divine essence in its undifferentiated unity. And this is why Ibn Arabi rejected the pretension of certain mystics who claimed, quote, become one with God. According to Corban, the mystical state of extinction, fana, has nothing to do with any kind of transition into a mode of consciousness that annuls the individuality of the mystic, quote, merging it with the so-called universal or the pure, inaccessible essence. Rather, Corban states, the highest mystical state to which the mystic can aspire is the particular divine name or set of divine names constituting the mystic's own particular law, Arabi. He claims that the self, which is realizable experiential, is therefore not the essence, or what Ibn Arabi calls the self of the real, nafs al-haq. Rather, it's the figure who represents the self in mental vision. The paredros, as Corban calls him, the Gnostic, is one of the ways in which Corban refers to the Ein Thabita, the companion on the divine essence, actually, of the Gnostic. His companion archetype, his eternal hexeity, it's another way that Corban refers to Ein Thabita, invested with the divine name in the world of mystery. In other words, the soul can only encounter her own divine counterpart, her Ein, fulgurating with the divine qualities invested in the Ein by the effusion of being. Izutsu also restricts the scope of mystical realization to the level of the individual's immutable archetype. I won't actually read what Izutsu says, it's more or less the same as what Corban claims, so I'll go straight on. The first thing to say by way of critique of this position is to admit that Ibn Arabi does insist that there is an ineluctable ontological dualism defining the sphere within which all forms of mystical experience involving the individual per se are located. That is, the duality constituted by creator and creature. For as long as the individual soul exists, whatever experience she can have of the divine reality, I say she because the soul in Arabic is nafs, which is feminine, is inescapably located within and therefore circumscribed by his own immutable archetype. God's self-revelation, his theophany, his tajalli, is granted to the individual, Ibn Arabi says, only in a form, quote, conforming to the essential predisposition of the recipient of such a revelation. So the recipient, that is the mystic visionary, sees nothing other than his own form in the mirror of the reality. He does not see the reality itself, which is not possible. So when the mystic attains this vision of the divine in his own essential predisposition, then he's got as far as he can go in his visionary, the summit of his spiritual experience. He says to such a person, you have experienced as much as is possible for a created being, so do not seek nor weary yourself in any attempts to proceed higher than this, for there is nothing higher, nor is there beyond the point you have reached anything except the pure, undetermined, unmanifested absolute. But we need to focus on the wording here very carefully. You have experienced as much as is possible for a created being. That is, fi haqq al-makhluq, which could also be translated as according to that which is right or appropriate for the creature. And here we should note the famous Sufi saying, As-Sufi lam yukhlaq, the Sufi is not created, which recalls the saying of Meister Eckhart that there is something in the soul that is uncreated and uncreatable, and this is the intellect. So the soul, qua creature, should not tire herself about seeking that which goes beyond her creator, the pure, undetermined, unmanifested absolute. But again, we need to add the caveat. This does not mean that the creator cannot lift the creature out of the limits of her creatureliness. It does not mean that the creator cannot do this. It means that the uncreated light can, in fact, liberate its own ray or its spark, which is temporarily and apparently trapped within the creator's soul. The subtle nexus of relationships at once uniting and separating the created cosmos and the transcendent essence of the creator is finely intimated through Ibn Arabi's esoteric interpretation of the following Quranic verse. Quote, this is verse 119 of Surah number 18, titled The Cave. Let him not associate anyone with his Lord's worship. I actually think that should be verse 110. Let him not associate anyone with his Lord's worship. The literal meaning of the verse relates to the prohibition of shirk, associating false gods with the true divinity. Ibn Arabi makes the one in question refer to the essence. He says, God is not worshipped. He is not worshipped in respect of his unity, since unity contradicts the existence of the worshipper. It's as if he, God, is saying, what is worshipped is only the Lord in respect of his lordship, since the Lord brought you into existence. So connect yourself to him and make yourself lowly before him, and do not associate unity with lordship in worship. For unity does not know you and will not accept you. Worship, therefore, relates the slave to the Lord. This worship is described most astonishingly by Ibn Arabi in terms of accident or accident. Slave is an accident. The Lord is an accident. In another formulation, Ibn Arabi says something even more scandalous, stating, he praises me, Yahmaduni, and I praise him. He worships me, I worship him. And so where is God's independence? He needs me as I need him. One of the many reasons why Ibn Arabi was regarded as a blasphemer and a heretic by so many authorities in the tradition of Islamic law. But interestingly also, in the list of fatwas that was made by Osman Yahya, it's about 50-50, that half of the theologians and jurisprudence who gave judgments against Ibn Arabi's orthodoxy, it was 50-50. Half said he was a heretic, the other half said no, he's perfectly orthodox. Because Ibn Arabi's whole perspective is so totally riveted to the Quran. If we now can glimpse the metaphysical import of this rhetorical dialectic intended to highlight the relativity of everything other than God, ma siwa, we will be able to shift gear, as it were, and to appreciate the limitations of creaturely state worship and the accidentalities attendant upon the relationship between the slave and the Lord are not insuperable. That is, the limitations in question do not preclude the possibility of metaphysical tawheed being realized. This realization of oneness being predicated not on the union between the slave and the Lord, but rather on the extinction of the human ego in the bosom of the divine self. in unitive experience of the absolute, that is, a state called Thana. This will be traditional. Let's take careful note of the following description given by Ibn Arabi of his own experience of extinction. This comes in one of his accounts of his spiritual ascent, his Mi'raj. He journeys through the various heavens and is granted graces and knowledge proper for those heavens until he attains the limits of his creaturely possibilities, and he cries out, "Enough, enough. My bodily elements are filled up, and my place cannot contain me." And then God lifted from me my contingent dimension, my imkan, which would also be translated as my possibility. That which, in other words, makes for his specificity, his distinctiveness, thus its relativity. And he makes this beautiful rhyming prose, Hasbi, Hasbi, qad mala'at arkani, wala wasa'ani, makani, farrafa'a anni, imkani. Thus I attained in this nocturnal journey the inner realities of all the names, and I saw them returning to one musamma, one object named, and one ayn, one essence. That object named was what I witnessed, my mashhud, mashhudi, and that ayn, that essence, that one essence, was my being, wujudi. But my voyage was only in myself and pointed to myself. And through this, I came to know that I was a pure slave without a trace of lordship in me at all. It's quite amazing juxtaposition of this unitive realization of the self with the understanding that he was nothing but a slave without any trace of lordship in him. Note that he does not claim to have transcended his contingent dimension, his aim. Rather, it lifted from him by an act of pure grace. But can we talk about him and his journey within himself and pointing to himself? Can we talk about him in the absence of this contingent dimension, his possibility, his aim? If the ontological infrastructure of his particular being has been effaced, then there is no individuality that can be the agent in the act of transcendence, realization of transcendence. And by the same metaphysical logic, it cannot be the individual soul or the supramanifest archetype of Ibn Arabi, the aim. It cannot be the soul or the archetype to which the inner realities of all of the names of God return. Even if he says that these divine realities, designated by the names, return to the one object named, which is his object of witnessing what he saw, his mashhud, and they return to the one essence, which has become his own being, his wujud. The transcendent level of the identity being proclaimed can only be predicated of Ibn Arabi insofar as it is the immanence of divine being, mysteriously in, but not of, the soul of Ibn Arabi. So here we can imagine Ibn Arabi as a mirror, an image of the essence being projected onto this mirror. And it's that ray emanating from the essence to the mirror of Ibn Arabi's own archetypal reality, which is non-existent. But it is projected onto that, and it's that which returns to the source of its projection. It is this that realizes itself as pure being, whence the aptness of the following utterance by Ibn Arabi of his first and his decisive vision. When I kept knocking on God's door, and this, by the way, is when Ibn Arabi was apparently about 13 or 14 years old, and wanted to find God, and was told, go out, invoke the name of Allah. Do it by a graveyard, do it somewhere quiet. He went on, just saying Allah, Allah, Allah. And he said, before dawn, so he'd be doing this for about 4 or 5 hours. Before dawn, this is what happens. When I kept knocking on God's door, I waited mindfully, not distracted. until there appeared to the eye the glory of his face, and a call to me, nothing else. I encompassed being in knowledge. Nothing is in my heart but God. Everything we have mentioned after that in all our speech, that is in all of his books, his kalam, everything he's written about, everything we have mentioned after that in all our speech is only the differentiation of the all-inclusive reality which was contained in that look at the one reality. I encompass being in knowledge, he says. And when this statement is conjoined to his definition of being in terms of the three words wujud, wijdan, wajd, all three words being derived from the same root, wow, jeen, dal, being, consciousness, and bliss. We cannot but recall, on the one hand, Satchitananda formula in Advaita Vedanta, and on the other, Meister Eckhart's scandalous utterance. While I yet stood in my first cause, I had no God, and was my own cause. I wanted nothing, and desired nothing, for I was bare being, and the knower of myself in the enjoyment of truth. We've got Sat Chit Ananda, Wujud, Wijdan, and Wajd very clearly being mirrored. The I in question for both Eckhart and Ibn Arabi cannot in any way be identified with their individual souls. For Eckhart, the soul as such is a pure nothing. And for Ibn Arabi, the essence or archetype of the soul is immutable in its non-existence. Also, we have this idea of whiffing something. He says the ain, the archetype of the soul, has never whiffed existence. It's purely intelligible in the divine mystery, but it is not existential in any sense. In his treatise on the divine name, Ibn Arabi writes that when he wished to enter into the being of the real, he had to disappear. Quote, leaving my place to his reality. His manifestation, therefore, rests on a disappearance. The manifestation of Hua, he, who is God, comes about when I am no longer I, since this I prevents him from being him. If the I subsists during the manifestation of him, one will then have you. So we can only speak in a highly provisional and approximate manner in saying that the soul sees God or realizes the self only after having been annihilated from herself. For in reality, none can either know or see God but God, a principle illustrated by Ibn Arabi in commenting upon the famous formulation of an earlier Sufi, Abu Talib al-Makki. None sees him to whom nothing is similar, but him to whom nothing is similar, changing the first H from capital him to lowercase h for the one sees. Ibn Arabi adds that the one who sees is thus identical to the one seen. So when he talks about seeing God, he tells us that the nature of this divine vision is such that the seer and the seen are but one. This can only mean that the immanent light of pure consciousness within the individual escapes the illusory limitations of individuality, which Ibn Arabi elsewhere refers to as the darkness of non-existence, and comes to realize its plenary nature. He says, the object of vision, which is the real, is light, while that through which the perceiver perceives him is light. Hence, light becomes included within light. It is as if it returns to the root from which it became manifest. So nothing sees him but he. You, in respect of your archetype, are identical with shadow, not light. The light of being mysteriously resides within the shadow of the existentiated individual, but it is at the same time veiled by that which it permeates. he says, Ibn Arabi says, know that whenever something permeates another thing, the first thing is necessarily contained in the second. The permeator becomes veiled by the permeated, so that the passive one, that is the permeated, is the outward or apparent, the zahir, while the active one, i.e. the permeator, is the inward, the batin, which is invisible. Let's now have a look at another account of Ibn Arabi's ascension. Here the climax is expressed as follows. God made his throne to be a couch for me, the kingdom to be a slave for me. The king was made a prince to me. Thus I remained in that state, unaware of anything comparable to myself among the archetypes, the adyan. As we said earlier, the slave remains always the slave. He never becomes the lord. That's why Ibn Arabi does not refer to himself as having become the king, al-Malik, one of the names of God, even though God's throne has become his couch and God's kingdom has become a slave for him, and that the king has become a prince for him. But for him, precisely insofar as he does not exist either as an individual soul or within his individual archetype. The only self that can be posited as the agent here is what we referred to earlier as the self of the real, nafs al-haq, which has no common measure with the plane of non-existence on which the archetypes are conceivable. Hence, the Ibn Arabi saying, I remained in that state, unaware of anything comparable to myself among the archetypes. So the only self that can be aware of being in a state which is incomparable with anything of the archetypic plane, that self can only be supreme self. It's therefore this uncreated subjectivity at once transcendent vis-a-vis the archetypes and immanently residing within each one of them. It's this consciousness proper to the uncreated subjectivity that alone can be said to surpass the plane of being on which these dualities, king, kingdom, lord, slave, appear to subsist. If Ibn Arabi rhetorically employs the first person in his ascension narratives, and simultaneously claims to have transcended the plane of the archetypes, then in good metaphysical logic, the subjectivity in question can only be that of the divine self, by which the limited subjectivity of the mystic has been extinguished from itself prior to being reabsorbed within the self. The ray of light returns to the source whence it was projected. The drop returns to the ocean from which it was separated. Let's take a sideways glance now at some lines from Hussein ibn Mansur, arguably the most famous of all the Sufis, renowned for his theopathic utterance, I am the real, or I am the truth, al-haq. The following verses reinforce the lesson that Ibn Arabi teaches all Muslims about the vital importance of distinguishing between the nothingness of the individual soul in relation to the soul reality of God. Sorry about that unintended pun. 1, Allah says, kill me, my trusted friends, for in my being killed lies my life. My death is in my life, and my life is in my death. اقتلوني يا ثقاتي إن في قتل حياتي ومماتي في حياتي ومماتي. Second line of poetry, really quite an extraordinary line. So, in my extinction was extinguished, and in my extinction you found yourself. ففي فنائي فنا فنائي ففي فنائي وجدت أنت. Al-Hallaj sings these verses in the full knowledge that his creaturely self is Nasut, has been eclipsed, extinguished, or annihilated by the divine presence, Lahut. This is from the words Nas in Arabic, which means people, humankind, and Allah, of course, meaning God. So the Nasut is the creaturely dimension, the Lahut is the divine dimension. He now speaks from the point of view of the immanent divinity, knowing that it is now God who speaks through him. In accordance with the principle expressed in the saying of the Prophet, it can be regarded as the most important prophetic allusion to theosis in the Islamic tradition, the so-called Hadith al-Nawafil, hadith pertaining to supererogatory works. This is a hadith in which God is speaking in the first person. It's not part of the Quran. It's a highly substantiated, strongly substantiated hadith in the tradition of the sayings of the Prophet. My slave draws near to me through nothing I love more than that which I have made legally incumbent upon him. But then we have a shift. My slave never ceases to draw near to me through supererogatory acts until I love him. So on the one hand, we have God united nothing more than the prayers, and the fasting, and the alms taxes, and so on that were made obligatory. He loved nothing more than those acts. But now he says that my slave never ceases to draw to me through supererogatory acts, those that go over and above the legal minimum, devotional acts which are optional, until I love him. And when I love him, I become, here you have to understand literally, I was or I am, in the Arabic, kuntu. I become his hearing by which he hears, his sight by which he sees, his hand by which he strikes, and his foot by which he walks. Let's conclude with one of the many esoteric commentaries of Ibn Arabi on this hadith, which is already esoteric in its literal meaning. This takes us a step closer to appreciating the radically metaphysical conception of Tawheed, of realizing oneness, which undergirds a Sufi understanding of this. Ibn Arabi says, God's word, kuntu, I was or I am, showed that this was already the situation. That is, that God was always the hearing, the seeing, and the acts of the slave. But the slave was not aware of it. Hence, the generous gift which this nearness gives to the slave is the unveiling of the knowledge that God is, in fact, his hearing and his sight. What this implies is that there is no change of ontological agency. God does not become the faculties of the slave after having allowed the slave to enjoy in his previous condition the status of autonomous agency. God is and cannot but be the true agent of all the slave's actions and perceptions. The only change is in the awareness of the slave, his assimilation of the truth that God's unity includes all relative realities while excluding all ontological alterity or otherness. And it's this truth which was veiled from the slave by the function of his own faculties. But as we noted earlier, the slave remains devoted to his Lord. His devotion is deepened rather than being mitigated by his realization of oneness. Ibn Arabi says, the final end and the ultimate return of the Gnostics, that is the Orafa, the Arifun, those who really know, the final end, the ultimate return of the Gnostics is that the real is identical with them, while they do not exist. Finally, we can sum up the perspective of Ibn Arabi in terms of an esoteric Greek reformulation of the first testimony of Islam. La ilaha illallah, no divinity but the one divinity, no God but God. We can sum up this perspective in terms of the following formulation. No theosis without kenosis. Understanding theosis as metaphysical tawheed and kenosis as Anam. Such is the message, the following divine utterance ascribed to Imam Ali, referred to by Bishop Shaw as the esoteric representative par excellence of Islam. He also referred to Imam Ali as the St. John of Islam. This is another hadith Qudsi in which Ali puts these words into the mouth of God. This can be read as a commentary on the prophetic allusion to Theosis, rendering more explicit the consequences, at once devastating and deifying, of being loved by God. Who seeketh me, findeth me. Who findeth me, knoweth me. Who knoweth me, loveth me. Who loveth me, I love. Whom I love, I slay. Whom I slay, I must requite. Whom I must requite, myself am the requital. Thank you for listening.
Questions? Right.
I studied for 8 years as the only non-Muslim student at a Muslim divinity school. And my professors were all Sunni, all very sympathetic to the falsafa tradition and very hostile to Sufism. And whenever the topic came up, they would quote Hallaj on al-Haq as the epitome of, well, the reason for their rejection of that tradition, dissolving the distinction between the creator and the creating. I noticed that you, in tracing Ibn Arabi's thought here, you referred to Hallaj sort of as a lateral sort of connection, but not that they would have seen Hallaj's statement as kind of the root of Ibn Arabi's rejecting Ibn Arabi as well through that same tradition. Do you think that there's not that kind of direct influence, Hallaj to Ibn Arabi, that they're just independent traditions? What connection do you see there?
Yeah. Well, one doesn't have to posit a direct influence of the one or the other. From within the Sufi tradition, it would be regarded as these two mystics, and indeed of all of the mystics of all of the traditions preceding Islam, as having attained the same vision of the meaning of divine unity. So it would just be light upon light from within the Sufi tradition. It would be Ibn Arabi confirming through the light of his vision of divine reality, the experience, the realization that Hallaj had of assimilating and becoming one with that same light. And so it would really be a question of, and I would stress this, and I was asked by someone to restore the status of the cat from the perennial philosophy point of view, and I'm going to try and do that now, which is that verse 48 of chapter 5 of the Quran does not refer to cats, in case you're wondering. But it says that we have revealed unto thee, O Muhammad, this book with the truth, bil-haq, that it may be a musaddiq and a muhaymin. Musaddiqan lima bayna yadayhi min al-kitab wa muhayminan alayhi. This book, this Quranic revelation, may be a confirmation of all scripture that came before the Quran, and that it may be a protector, a guardian in relation to all those scriptures that came before. So what's it got to do with Ibn Arabi? It's got this point that the Quranic revelation confirms the light of all the previous revelations. It confirms that they've all come from God. And that whereas the exoteric scholars of Islam would see the coming of Islam as abrogating all previous revelations. Ibn Arabi says this is complete nonsense, abrogation. What the Quran does is what the sun does when it rises. And when the sun's light rises, it does not nullify the lights emanating from all of the stars that were previously suns in their own right. But what the sun of Islam, of the Quran does, is it confirms, it's the tasdiq, musaddiq, the same word. It confirms the light. So all of those lights are included in the light of the Quranic revelation, confirmed by them, included within them, and not in any way abrogated by the Quran. So in exactly the same way, a mystic within the tradition of a Hallaj or an Ibn Arabi would talk about all of the mystical realizations of a Plato, of why was Plato called Al-Aflatun Al-Ilahi, the divine Plato, by these mystics. And Ibn Arabi was himself called Ibn Aflatun, the son of Plato. It's because all the sages, all of the mystics, all of the saints of all of the previous traditions, all of them have had this experience of divine oneness, and therefore it's nurun ala nur, light upon light. So I don't think one needs to posit any kind of direct influence. They had the vision of the ultimate reality, and it may differ in terms of the way in which the experience is vocalized after it. But the essential element of that experience is that you're aware, as he says, the Arif is aware that the Haqq is identity, is Ain, is his very identity, while he, as an individual, does not exist. La ilaha illallah. You were going to come back at some time.
Well, maybe there's others, but I can, yeah, I do have a follow-up, but.
Well, your follow-up then is.
So, you also mentioned that Ibn Arabi's, we mentioned his anchoredness, his rootedness in the Quran.
Right.
And that would have been another criticism. So some of my philosophy circles in the Turkish-speaking world are of the Quran-only movement, Quranists, and equally as Quranists, as taking pride in their rootedness in Quran only, and from that, equally rejecting the al-Haq, Ibn Arabi, that's the Sufi tradition. How would you respond to that?
Well, with Massegnon's arguments, where Massegnon's great work on showing that the mystical lexicon in Islam was totally rooted in Quranic concepts. It was really there to deflect the criticisms made against Sufism, that Sufism cannot possibly come out of the Quran and the Hadith. It's so bland, it's so colorless. How could all these great mystical realizations come from something so uneven and so uninspired? Sufism must have come from Christianity. Bayezid al-Bastami must have learned all of these great realities from his Christian master or his Zoroastrian teacher or his ancestry, something like that. So Massenon wrote this book to show, no, every single thing that the Sufis talk about can be found in the Quran. And most importantly, I suppose, to give the most obvious and important example, is that the very terms that the Sufis use as regards extinction and subsistence, fana and baqa, those are very firmly rooted in the Quranic discourse. And the great Al-Ghazali, who I don't think your philosophy friends would criticize.
So all very happy with Ghazali.
They're very happy with Ghazali. So that's what I would say to them. So look at what Al-Ghazali does to the verses of the Quran, which talk about, for example, كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه. Halik is another word like fana. It means time being destroyed. And so in the most important verse that Massenon, first of all, would talk about is the one that says, كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام. It's in the Surah Ar-Rahman, which is Surah number 55. Everything on the face of the earth is in a state of passing away, is transient, is evanescent. كل من عليها فان, where we get فنا. ويبقى, يبقى, where we get بقى. What subsists alone is the face of the Lord. وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, the owner of majesty and bounty. And so another verse which is very similar to that is the one I just quoted from, I think it's Surah number 17. Everything is perishing except his face. إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ. So the literal meaning is that everything is going to die except God's reality. God is eternal. What does Ghazali do to that? He says, no. The esoteric meaning here is that the face of the thing, which is the divine face within the thing, subsists forever. That everything has two faces. Wajhain. One wajh is the thing pertaining to its own existence, and that in that respect, it is a pure non-entity. It will pass away because it already is now nothing but an illusion. And the only face that will not perish is the face of God that subsists within each and everything in existence. And it's by virtue of that name that the thing has existence, has whatever qualities it has, and that will never perish. That is the immortality of the soul that rejoins the eternity of the divine. So I think that's how I would respond.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to come in? Other questions?
There's one over here.
Please.
Just a clarification, if I heard you right, did you mention that there's teachings of Al-Farabi about the soul being uncreated?
Al-Farabi or Ibn Arabi?
Ibn Arabi. Did you mention that?
It's a Sufi maxim. No one knows who actually said it, but it's just affirmed that the true Sufi, because remember, in the tradition, the Sufis would not refer to themselves saying, we are the Sufis. The greatest of the Sufis would say, we are people of blame. We're the ones that you should be blaming and criticizing and censuring and ostracizing. The Malamatiya that Ibn Arabi refers to as the highest of the Sufis. They're the ones who say, no, we've got nothing special, there's nothing great about us. They hide their spiritual states. And they just say, no, we've got nothing to do with the Sufis. The true Sufis are the ones who have attained the end of the path. So the others are called mutasawwifin, those who are trying to enter into tasawwuf, trying to attain to this purification and the aspiration to become a true Sufi. So this is a maxim within the Sufi tradition that says, a Sufi lam yuh. The Sufi is not created. Meaning that the essence, the divine face that inheres within each and every individual, but in the Sufi who has realized this truth, that divine face is not created. It is the divine within the Sufi that has become self-realized. The true Sufi is the one who has realized that his or her essence is the uncreated essence of God and nothing else. That is all there is in existence. So that's why he can see, she can see through his or her own illusory individuality to the ultimate reality of the divinity within him